July 10, 1940, the day the sky over Britain turned into a killing field. Two fighters, each one the pride of its nation, each one carrying a pilot who knew one of them wasn't coming home. The Supermarine Spitfire versus the Messerschmitt Bf 109. And for the next 4 months, they would write the most brutal chapter of aerial warfare the world had ever seen. Now here's something that might surprise you. These two aircraft, sworn enemies in the deadliest sense, they were born from the same ideas, the same desperate need for speed, for firepower, for survival. And by the summer of 1940, when Germany launched what they called Operation Adler, Eagle Attack, these machines and the men who flew them would decide whether Britain stood or fell. The Spitfire, you see, it wasn't just a fighter plane. To the British, it was hope with wings, a symbol that said, "We will not go quietly." Designed by Reginald Mitchell, a man who was literally dying as he created it, succumbing to cancer even as he drafted the most beautiful killing machine ever built. Mitchell died in 1937, just months after the first Spitfire flew. He never saw it in combat, never knew that his creation would save a nation. And the Bf 109, well, that was Willy Messerschmitt's answer to the same question every nation was asking in the 1930s. How do we survive the next war? The 109 first saw combat in Spain in 1937 during the Civil War there. German pilots, volunteers they called them, though everyone knew better, they took those 109s up against outdated Soviet fighters, and they learned. They learned how to kill efficiently, how to dive, how to strike and disappear before the enemy even knew what hit them. By the time Britain's radar stations picked up the first massive formations on July 10, 1940, the Luftwaffe had something like 1,100 fighters ready to go. Among them, 760 were Bf 109s, the E model, the Emil as pilots called it. Britain could muster maybe 640 fighters total, and of those, only about 350 were Spitfires. The rest, they were Hurricanes, good planes, tough planes, but not quite in the same league when it came to pure performance. See, here's where it gets interesting. The numbers, they tell you one story, but the sky tells you another. The Bf 109E, it could hit speeds around 354 miles per hour at altitude, powered by that Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, a fuel-injected monster that gave German pilots an advantage that would save their lives over and over again. The Spitfire Mk1, she could reach about 362 miles per hour with her Rolls-Royce Merlin 3 engine, slightly faster, but here's the thing, it was close, too close for comfort. Both aircraft carried 8 machine guns in their wings. The Spitfire, 8.303 Brownings, same as the Hurricane, standard British armament. The Bf 109E had 2 7.92mm machine guns in the nose, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, and 2 20mm cannons in the wings. Those cannons, they were the real killers. One good hit from a 20mm shell, and you weren't limping home, you were bailing out if you were lucky. The fighting, when it started that summer, it wasn't like the movies make it out to be. It was chaos, pure chaos. German formations would come in, sometimes 300, 400 aircraft at once, bombers protected by fighters, and the British, they had to scramble, get up there as fast as possible, climb to meet them. And here's a brutal truth, altitude meant life. The side that had height, they controlled the fight. They could dive, pick their target, fire, and use that speed to zoom back up before anyone could react. The Bf 109 had an edge in the climb. It could get to 20,000 feet in about 7.5 minutes. The Spitfire took a bit longer, maybe 8 to 9 minutes, depending on the model and conditions. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But in aerial combat, 60 seconds might as well be an hour. Those German pilots, they'd wait up there, 25,000, 28,000 feet, engines throttled back, watching the British fighters claw their way up, and then they'd pounce. But the Spitfire had something the 109 didn't, something that mattered just as much as speed or firepower. She could turn. Oh, God, could she turn! The Spitfire's elliptical wing, that beautiful curved design that made her so recognizable, wasn't just for looks. It gave her a turning radius that the 109 couldn't match. A German pilot would get on a Spitfire's tail, think he had him, squeeze the trigger, and that Spitfire would just roll, bank hard, tighten the turn, and suddenly the hunter became the hunted. German pilots, the smart ones, they learn fast. Never try to turn with a Spitfire. You use your speed, your climb rate. You make one pass, and if you don't get him, you dive away, build up speed, come back for another try. It became doctrine. Boom and zoom, they called it in English. The Americans would later perfect it, but the Germans, they wrote the book on it in 1940. Now let me tell you about the fuel injection, because this is where engineering decided who lived and died. The Merlin engine in the Spitfire, it used carburetors to mix fuel and air. Good system, reliable, but it had a flaw. If you pushed the nose down hard into a steep dive or a negative G maneuver, the fuel would slosh in the carburetor. The engine would sputter, sometimes cut out completely for a few seconds. Those few seconds, that's an eternity in combat. The DB601 in the Bf-109 had direct fuel injection. A German pilot could push that stick forward, go into any attitude, any dive, any maneuver, and that engine would just keep running. So a Spitfire pilot would get a 109 on his tail. He'd try to dive away or push over into a negative G dive, and his engine would cough, splutter, and that German behind him, his engine would keep screaming, keep closing the distance. British engineers, they knew about this problem. By early 1941, they'd developed a fix, a simple restrictor in the fuel line, Miss Schilling's orifice, they called it, named after the engineer Beatrice Schilling who designed it. But in the summer of 1940, through August, September, into October, Spitfire pilots had to live with that limitation. They had to think about it every time they moved that stick, every time they made a decision in combat. The pilots themselves, they came from everywhere. Britain had its own, of course, but also Poles who'd escaped when Germany invaded their country in 1939, Czechs who fled the occupation, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, even Americans who weren't supposed to be there, not officially, because America was still neutral. These men joined the Eagle squadrons, flying for Britain before America entered the war. On the German side, you had veterans from Spain, from Poland, from the invasion of France. These weren't beginners. By the summer of 1940, some of these pilots had 20, 30, 40 victories. Men like Adolf Galland, Werner Mölders, they were already legends. Galland once said, and this stuck with people, when Hermann Goering asked him what he needed to beat the RAF, Galland replied, "A squadron of Spitfires." He respected that aircraft, even as he fought against it. The tactics, they evolved week by week. Early in the battle, the RAF flew in tight formations, the old peacetime formations, neat and orderly. But that didn't work. You spent so much time watching your wingmen, making sure you didn't collide, that you couldn't watch for the enemy. The Germans flew in loose pairs, a lead and a wingman. The wingman protected the lead did the hunting. The RAF learned, adapted, started using similar tactics by late August, and the losses, they became more even. Let's talk about the combat itself, what it was actually like up there. You'd take off, your Spitfire or your 109, you'd climb, and the higher you went, the colder it got. At 25,000 feet, it's well below freezing, minus 30, minus 40 degrees Celsius. Your breath would fog up the canopy, frost would form on the inside. You'd be wearing layers, heavy flight suit gloves, but your hands would still go numb. The noise, the constant roar of the engine, it was deafening. Pilots would come back deaf, temporarily or permanently, ears ringing for days. And then you'd see them, dots in the distance, growing larger. Your squadron leader would call out, "Bandits, 12 o'clock high," and your stomach would drop. Every single time. It didn't matter if it was your first mission or your 50th. That moment when you saw the enemy, your mouth would go dry. The combat itself, it lasted seconds, maybe a minute or two if you were unlucky. You'd try to get on someone's tail, line up the shot, your gun sight, just a simple ring and dot back then. You'd put the dot on the enemy aircraft, lead it just a bit, account for deflection, and squeeze the trigger. 8 machine guns would open up. The whole aircraft would shudder, vibrate, and you'd see your tracer rounds arcing out, trying to connect. If you hit something, you'd see pieces fly off, maybe smoke, maybe fire. If you hit the fuel tank and it caught, well, that was it. The aircraft would explode or burn, and the pilot, if he didn't get out immediately, if his canopy was jammed or if he was already wounded, he'd burn with it. A lot of pilots, they carried pistols, not to shoot at the enemy, but, well, in case they went down in flames and couldn't get out. Quick death was better than burning. Bailing out, that was its own nightmare. If you were over England, you might be okay. You'd land, maybe break an ankle or get dragged by your parachute, but you'd live. You could fight again. Over the Channel, you had maybe 10, 15 minutes before hypothermia would kill you, even in summer. The water was cold, always cold. Air-sea rescue, they did what they could, but a lot of pilots, British and German, they went into that water and never came out. And if you were a German pilot bailing out over England, well, you were a prisoner now. If you were lucky, the Home Guard or regular army would get to you first. If you were unlucky, it might be civilians who'd just been bombed, who'd lost their homes, their families. There were stories, not pretty stories, of German pilots who didn't make it to a POW camp, if you understand what I'm saying. The airfields, they were targets too. German bombers, escorted by Bf-109s, they'd hit the RAF bases, try to destroy the Spitfires and Hurricanes on the ground, crater the runways, kill the pilots before they could even take off. Some days you'd land, refuel, rearm, and take off again 3, 4, 5 times. The ground crews, they were working miracles, patching holes, replacing parts, doing in 20 minutes what should have taken 2 hours. By August 15th, what the Germans called Black Thursday, the battle reached its peak intensity. That day, the Luftwaffe flew over 2,000 sorties, attacking all across England. They lost 75 aircraft, the highest single-day loss they'd take in the entire battle. The RAF lost 34. But here's the thing, it wasn't sustainable for either side. Pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced, and in the RAF, that was the real crisis, not aircraft, but pilots. You see, Britain could build Spitfires, the factories were working around the clock, but training a pilot, that took months, and there wasn't time. So you had kids, 19, 20 years old, with maybe 10 hours in a Spitfire, going up against German veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The life expectancy of a new RAF pilot in the summer of 1940, it was measured in days, sometimes hours. Squadron 609, for example, they were stationed at Middle Wallop. In one 2-week period in August, they lost 12 pilots killed or missing. That's more than half the squadron. And they weren't unique. Every squadron had similar losses. The survivors, the ones who made it past the first few missions, they developed a kind of hardness, a detachment. You couldn't afford to think about the empty chairs in the mess hall, the beds that were suddenly vacant. The Bf-109 pilots had their own problems, though. Range, that was the killer for them. The 109E could stay in the air for maybe 90 minutes total. But they were flying from bases in France, crossing the Channel, escorting bombers deep into England, and then having to fly all the way back. By the time they reached the English coast, they had maybe 20, 30 minutes of fuel to fight with before they had to turn for home. British pilots, they knew this. Sometimes they'd just wait. Stay high, stay out of reach, let the Germans burn their fuel, and then attack as they turned for home, when they were low on ammunition, low on fuel, and desperate to get back across the Channel. It was brutal, but it worked. A lot of Bf-109s ended up ditching in the Channel, pilots paddling their little inflatable dinghies, hoping someone would pick them up. The Spitfire had better range, not great, but better. She could stay up for maybe 2 hours if you were careful with the throttle, and she was fighting over home territory. Every minute spent in combat was a minute that could be spent fighting, not worrying about whether you'd make it back to base. Now the technology, it's worth talking about the details, because these machines, they were the absolute cutting edge for 1940. The Spitfire's Merlin 3 engine, it produced about 1,030 horsepower. That doesn't sound like much by modern standards, but for its time, it was incredible. 12 cylinders in a V configuration, liquid-cooled, and the sound, that Merlin roar, everyone in England knew that sound. It meant their boys were up there fighting. The Merlin had one big advantage. It was reliable. Rolls-Royce had been building engines for years. They knew what they were doing. A Merlin could take damage, lose a cylinder, overheat, and still get you home. German pilots who flew captured Spitfires after the war, they always commented on that, how smooth the Merlin was, how refined. The DB601A in the 109, it was putting out about 1,175 horsepower in the E3 and E4 models. More powerful, more complex, and when it worked, it was magnificent. But it was finicky, temperamental. Overheat it, and you could crack the cylinder block. Push it too hard, and seals would blow. German ground crews, they spent a lot of time nursing those engines. The armament differences, they shaped tactics. The Spitfire's 8.303 machine guns, they could put out a tremendous volume of fire. We're talking about 9,600 rounds per minute total, all 8 guns combined. But the .303 round, it wasn't very powerful. You needed good, solid hits, sustained fire to bring down an enemy aircraft. A lot of combats, you'd hit the enemy, see strikes all over his aircraft, and he'd just keep flying. Get home, land with his plane looking like Swiss cheese. The Bf-109's cannons, those MGFF 20mm cannons, they had a low rate of fire, only 520 rounds per minute per gun, and they only carried 60 rounds per cannon. That's about 7 seconds of fire before you're empty. But one hit from a 20mm shell, it could take a wing off. It could explode your fuel tank. One hit, that's all it took. So the tactics were different. Spitfire pilots would get in close, 200, 300 yards, and hold the trigger down, walk their fire into the target. German pilots would be more selective, wait for the perfect shot, 100, 150 yards, squeeze off a 1-second burst, and if you hit, the job was done. By September, the battle changed character. The Germans switched their focus, stopped hitting the airfields as much, started bombing London and other cities. This was the Blitz, and it was meant to break British morale, to make them beg for peace. It had the opposite effect. British morale hardened, and strategically, it gave the RAF time to recover, to rebuild their strength. But the fighting in the air, it continued. October 1940 was still seeing massive air battles. October 15th, a large raid on London. The RAF claimed 85 German aircraft destroyed. The actual number was lower, 36, but still, it was a victory. The Germans were losing too many aircraft, too many pilots, and they weren't achieving their objectives. The thing about the Spitfire versus the Bf-109, though, the thing that made this matchup so compelling, it's that neither side had a decisive advantage. In a dogfight, one-on-one, it came down to the pilot. The aircraft were close enough in performance that skill, experience, luck, those were the deciding factors. A good German pilot in a Bf-109 could absolutely destroy a novice in a Spitfire, and a veteran Spitfire pilot could dance around a green German pilot and shoot him down without breaking a sweat. The machines were evenly matched, which meant every engagement was dangerous for both sides. Let me tell you about some of the men who flew these aircraft. Douglas Bader, a British pilot who'd lost both legs in a flying accident before the war. He flew with prosthetic legs, and he was one of the top pilots in the RAF. He claimed 23 victories, most of them during the Battle of Britain, before being shot down and captured in 1941. The Germans, they respected him so much they actually retrieved one of his artificial legs from a crashed aircraft and returned it to him in the POW camp. Then there was Eric Locke, 21 years old during the Battle of Britain. He claimed 26 kills, and he was ruthless about it. Other pilots talked about how Locke would close to point-blank range before firing, making sure of the kill. He was shot down and killed in 1941, his body never found. On the German side, Helmut Wick, 25 years old, he had 56 victories by the time the Battle of Britain ended. He was a natural pilot, aggressive, fearless. November 28, 1940, he was shot down by a Spitfire pilot over the Isle of Wight. His body was never recovered from the Channel. Werner Mölders, another German ace, he had 115 victories by the end of his combat career, 28 of them during the Battle of Britain. He survived the battle, became a legend, but died in 1941 in a transport aircraft accident. The stories, they go on and on. Every pilot had his own narrative, his own close calls, his own techniques. Some relied on deflection shooting, leading the target. Others would get right up close and fire from zero deflection, straight on the target's tail. Some pilots painted their aircraft with distinctive markings, kill markings, personal emblems. Others kept their aircraft standard, didn't want to stand out. By late October, the weather started turning. British autumn weather, rain, fog, low clouds. It made large-scale raids harder. The Germans kept trying through November, but the intensity dropped off. By the end of November, Hitler had effectively given up on Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. Without air superiority, without control of the skies, an amphibious invasion was suicide, and he knew it. The final statistics, they depend on who you ask. The British claimed something like 2,600 German aircraft destroyed during the Battle of Britain. The actual German losses were closer to 1,900 aircraft, all types, not just fighters. The RAF lost about 1,500 aircraft, including around 450 Spitfires. But what mattered wasn't the numbers, not really. What mattered was that Britain held. The RAF had survived, the invasion never came, and the war would continue. The Spitfire and the Bf 109, they'd meet again and again throughout the war. North Africa in 1941 and 42, they'd fight over the desert. The Mediterranean, over Malta, some of the most vicious fighting of the war. Over France in 1943 and 44, as the Allies started going on the offensive. And finally, over Germany itself in 1944 and 1945, when Spitfires escorted American bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Both aircraft evolved. The Spitfire went through something like 20 different marks, variants, each one faster, more powerful, more deadly than the last. By 1944, the Spitfire Mark 14 with the Griffin engine could hit 450 miles per hour, and she could match anything the Germans had. The Bf 109 went through the F model, the G model, each one more refined. The number 109G, the Gustav, it was faster, better armed than the Amel, but also heavier, less maneuverable. The grace of the early 109s, it was gone, replaced by raw power. But the Battle of Britain, that was their defining moment. That's when these two aircraft wrote themselves into history. It wasn't the biggest air battle of the war. That would come later over Germany, when hundreds of bombers and fighters would fill the sky. But it was the most important, because if Britain had fallen in 1940, the war in Europe would have been over. There would have been no base for the Americans to launch D-Day from in 1944. The Soviet Union would have faced Germany alone, and who knows how that turns out. The men who flew these aircraft, they paid the price for victory. Of the roughly 3,000 pilots who flew for the RAF during the Battle of Britain, about 550 were killed during the battle itself. That's a casualty rate of over 18% in just 4 months. Hundreds more were wounded, burned, maimed for life. The German losses were similar in proportion. These were young men, most of them in their 20s, some of them teenagers. And they died in the sky over England in machines that were beautiful and deadly in equal measure. There's a memorial now in Westminster Abbey to the few, that's what Churchill called them. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The memorial lists all their names, British, Commonwealth, European, even the Americans who fought before America entered the war. It's a long list, too long, but every name represents a story, a life, a sacrifice. When you look at a Spitfire today in a museum or at an air show, when you hear that Merlin engine fire up, it's not just nostalgia, it's remembrance. That aircraft and the men who flew her, they stood between civilization and darkness, and they won. Not because they had better machines, because they didn't, not really. The Bf 109 was every bit as good, every bit as deadly. They won because they refused to lose, because every morning they climbed into those cockpits knowing they might not come back, and they went up anyway. The Battle of Britain ended in late October, early November 1940, depending on which historian you ask. But the rivalry between the Spitfire and the Bf 109, that lasted until the end of the war. Every time they met, it was a test, a challenge. Pilots on both sides knew if you saw the enemy, if it came down to a fight, it was going to be close. Respect, that's what they had for each other, even as they tried to kill each other. In the end, the Spitfire became the symbol. She's the aircraft everyone remembers, the graceful elliptical wings, the elegant lines, the sound of the Merlin. But the Bf 109, she deserves equal recognition. More 109s were built than any other fighter in history, over 33,000 of them by the end of the war. She served on every front, from the Arctic to North Africa, from the Atlantic to the Eastern Front. She was versatile, effective, and deadly. But in the summer of 1940, over the green fields of southern England, over the white cliffs of Dover, over London burning under German bombs, it was the Spitfire and the Bf 109 that wrote the most important chapter in their story. Two machines, evenly matched, flown by brave men on both sides, fighting for their countries, for their ideals, for their very survival. That's what the Battle of Britain was, and that's why, 85 years later, we still remember it. So if you found this deep dive into history interesting, there's another battle I covered that you might want to check out. Just click that video, and I'll see you there.